Hello again. Welcome. Dear panelists, dear participants, I'm delighted to welcome you all here on behalf of Raoul Wallenberg Institute of Human Rights and Humanitarian Law. Thank you all for joining. My name is Şebnem Kiniş. I'm Senior Policy Advisor on Gender and Human Rights in the Institute. I will be moderating our conversation today. Our topic today is gendered human rights implications of COVID-19. In this webinar, we will seek to provide critical insights into the effects of the pandemic and human rights of women. We will also discuss what should be done to better respond to amplified gender inequalities and increased gender-based violence and intersectional discrimination in the context of COVID-19. The webinar is currently being recorded and live streamed on Facebook. Before telling more about this very exciting webinar, I would like to first invite Morten Kirum, the director of Raoul Wallenberg Institute, for his welcoming remarks. The floor is yours, Morten.
Thank you very much, Şebnem. See if we can get a camera on. I'm not sure if I'm in charge of the camera. Guess not. But welcome to all of you. It's really a great pleasure for me to see, first of all, welcome such a prominent panel that we have here for the discussion today, but also seeing so many participants taking part in this very important and timely discussion. I think we all agree that the past 6 to 12 months have been a gigantic mirror for all of us, for our societies, where human rights issues and inequalities have sort of stood out very clearly. But also the alterations in our everyday life has offered a unique opportunity to see our surroundings in a new way. And of course, not least the concerns regarding gender. I don't know if there's a video. I see some comments now that...
Could you try turning your video on, Morten?
I tried before.
Yes,
now,
it works now.
Yeah.
Good to see you again.
I think you got my first remarks at least, so I will not repeat that. But anyhow, what we have definitely seen during these months of COVID-19 is sort of the deepened existing gender inequalities. Evidence has definitely already showed us that I'm still getting these messages. It's what? Very good. So that evidence has showed us that the impact of the pandemic has been shaped by the pre-existing inequalities, which are deeply entrenched in most of our societies, if not all our societies. But not only that, the pandemic has also amplified these inequalities when it comes to domestic violence, unpaid care work, and women's poverty, and many other issues. These are just some of them that are here to be addressed today and need to be addressed urgently in our societies. This crisis has also at the same time, I don't know if you noticed, it has been remarkable in the sense that we didn't have an enemy. I know there were some who tried to create an enemy, some other out there that we could blame for it, but never really had success. So that gave also a chance to all of us for a bit of reflection, sharper reflection, deeper reflection on some of that we saw or we see in the mirror. This, I think, we can use as a powerful opportunity to reshape, and as the UN says, rebuild better, build back better. Taking human rights framework and gender equality as our guiding principles in that building back. The first step is creating a better understanding of the gendered human rights implications of COVID-19. To this end, the Raoul Wallenberg Institute has launched a multi-country research initiative of COVID-19 gender and human rights. RWI partners and researchers across continents have been conducting a very rich and diverse set of research projects addressing a wide variety of human rights themes, such as women's and girls' rights to education, labor rights, sexual and reproductive health and rights, gender-based violence, and women's right to participation in the COVID-19 response and recovery. And in particular, I would say the last thing I look very much forward to listening into to see how do we ensure that increased participation. While this research is being undertaken, the Raoul Wallenberg Institute is also organizing webinars where experts are invited to discuss the COVID-19's gendered human rights impacts. This webinar that we're here today, that we just started, is the first public event of the multi-country research initiative on COVID-19, gender and human rights. The research and the ideas emanating from the discussions, from this discussion today, as well as discussion in subsequent seminars, will feed into those duty bearers. We'll ensure that it gets to the relevant duty bearers that are in the end responsible for ensuring human rights of women are protected in the COVID-19 response, as well as the recovery efforts. So I look very much forward to follow the discussion, and once again, a warm welcome to all of you, and I hope that you will enjoy it as well.
Many thanks, Martin. As Martin said, this is a very exciting event for us for a few reasons. First, this is the first public webinar that is hosted by RWI. We are not very experienced in this, but we love the idea of gathering hundreds of people for this conversation from all over the world without flying anyone, with no greenhouse gas emissions. We will definitely do more of this. And second, we have an impressive audience here from, I guess, 30 plus countries from all the continents. We have attendees from Peru, China, Australia, Finland, South Africa, Belarus, and many other countries. Aside from this wide regional coverage, I have to say I'm also very impressed with the profile of attendees. I have had the chance to scan through the organizations and titles of the registrants. We have academics, we have public officials from a wide range of public institutions, such as gender commissions, national human rights commissions, prisons and correctional services. We have corporates, we have representatives of national, regional, and international NGOs. We have students. There are also staff from multilateral organizations, such as the United Nations and the Council of Europe. We have also independent researchers, and it is great pleasure to have you all here. And we are very much looking forward to your contributions and questions. Third reason why this is a very exciting event for us is that this is the first ever public event of our multi-country study on gender equality, human rights, and COVID-19, as Morten already mentioned. The Institute, in collaboration with our partners and researchers in Belarus, Cambodia, China, Turkey, regional Africa, and Zimbabwe, has initiated this research initiative to analyze COVID-19's gendered impacts on human rights. And our esteemed researchers are also with us here today, and they are coming from very different disciplinary backgrounds, including law, social sciences, population studies, gender studies, political science, among others. And their projects will lead to several papers and a publication that we plan to finalize and share with you by the end of the year. And the other reason that makes this webinar very exciting for us is, of course, our fantastic speakers. I would like to introduce our three fantastic panelists today. First, we are very fortunate to have Ms. Hilary Biedema, who is currently the chair of the CEDAW committee, which monitors the implementation of the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. She is a human rights lawyer, researcher, and women's rights activist. Hilary Biedema was first elected to CEDAW in 2013 for a 2-year term, and she was renominated in 2016. Over the past years, she has served on the working groups such as Access to Justice, the right to education, climate change and disaster risk reduction, among other groups. We are also very pleased to have with us today Ms. Meskerem Geset Techane, who is the member and former chair of the UN Working Group on Discrimination Against Women and Girls. She is a human rights lawyer and keen advocate of women's rights. She previously held positions as a High Court judge in Ethiopia and deputy director of the Institute for Human Rights and Development in Africa. She also served as an expert member in different working groups of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. And lastly, we have the pleasure to host Ms. Tai Yipyeon, who is the executive committee member of the Development Alternatives with Women for a New Era. Tai Yipyeon, she's a Chinese feminist author and activist. She co-leads Stone's sexual and reproductive health and rights activities. She participated in creating several vibrant women's organizations in China after the Fourth World Conference on Women Health in Beijing in 1995. She served as a member of UN Women's Asia Pacific Civil Society Advisory Group, and also currently she is a member of the Asia Pacific Regional Engagement Mechanism. I would like to thank all the panelists for being here today. It is a great pleasure and privilege to host you here. The first part of the webinar will involve a moderated panel discussion framed around a series of questions. After about 45 minutes of hearing from our panelists, we will turn to the Q&A box to respond to the questions posed by the audience. If you have any questions to the speakers, please type it in the Q&A box, not in the chat box. If you experience any technical issue, you can type it in the chat box, not in the Q&A box this time. You can also use the chat box if you want to share your comment or opinion. So Q&A box is for questions, chat box is for technical issues, as well as for any contribution you would like to make. Okay, I think we are all set now. Now let's begin our conversation. I will start by posing a question, and then I will invite the panelists to respond. So I would like to start by asking, what are the gendered impacts of the pandemic from international human rights perspective? How has COVID-19 crisis deepened gender inequalities and intersectional discrimination? Would you be so kind and provide also some examples of the adverse impact of COVID-19 on human rights of women and LGBTIs? I would like to invite Hilary to speak first. Welcome again.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And it is my pleasure to be addressing such an august assembly on such a topical issue. I thank you all. I would like to begin by affirming and agreeing with the earlier comment by Mr. Morton that the pandemic has actually exacerbated the fault lines that were already existing in the community, in the world. And in addition to doing that, ironically, it has shrunk spaces for engagement. Now, when you talk about the gendered impact, I can only talk about this against the backdrop of the convention, which looks at 16 specific areas of women's rights. Now, the pandemic has affected all those areas, but I would not like to go there in detail right now because it would maybe take away from the more specific examples. But briefly speaking, in the areas of health, education, employment, family rights, all these areas, the pandemic has had its impact in addition to women's participation in public life. The areas I'd like to look at closely in my presentation or in the opening statements are violence against women and education. In the area of violence against women, the committee, the CEDAW committee already has robust jurisprudence and robust guidelines, I would say, yes, guidelines. We have our general recommendations 19 and 35 on violence against women, and education apart from the Article 10. We also have the general recommendation 36. Now, the areas I will quickly look at as examples will show the areas in which the convention has been issuing concluding observations to states. In other words, had CEDAW been robustly adhered to or implemented, the understanding of substantive equality, the understanding and the implementation of non-discrimination, of intersecting discrimination, of disadvantaged groups of women would probably have better prepared us for this pandemic. Let me begin with the violence against women. In the advent of the pandemic, we have seen already that the confinement, the isolation that is suffered or that has followed the pandemic has increased levels of violence. Women are now constrained in many cases to live with their abusers, and the restrictions of movement have made it very difficult for them to complain, unlike men who have, in most cultures, a freer access to movement and to structures. So this is the first area that we've seen. So increased incidence of violence as a result of enclosed spaces and less reporting. Now, there is also the issue of technologically assisted violence, which is also, from the anecdotal reports we've been receiving, on the increase, because now the use of technology has increased, and those who have more advantage, more access, more power in this area are using it to perpetrate new forms or emerging forms of violence. We also have the support systems that are overwhelmed and that are responding to the COVID by restricting services. For example, the shelters, some of them have shut down, some of them have reduced services because precisely of the fear of infection. Then we have funding difficulties, because in this pandemic, the resources of states are geared more to the health sector, direct provision in the health sector, and not so much to violence or even the health-related aspects of violence. The economic dependence, therefore, by women on men generally, this is the general trend, has also increased this possibility of violence. One interesting point that came to us was the issue of data interpretation. With the pandemic, in some country, in a particular jurisdiction, let me put it this way, there was an increased number of men reporting. And so the figures showed that violence on men was greater. But this was because women could not have access to the institutions. So the issue of data has also been an area in which we need to look closely and interpret data dynamically, looking at all these parameters. Now with education, which is really an area in which we have seen a lot of clawback, the disproportionate effect is felt in the fact that women are more represented in the educational system as teachers, receptionists, canteen managers, and so on. Older women are more impacted because they tend to provide daycare services. So what we have seen actually coming out of education is that we have three clear groups of women. Women as educationists, women as users of the educational system, which helps to give care to their children, and the users, the learners themselves. Girls are more disadvantaged. So these are the three areas that we've seen. The learners particularly have felt the greatest impact. They are now home from school. They are excluded from school, which is a safe space. In many instances, school gave them one free hot meal a day. School protected them from excessive domestic work, opportunistic relationships, exposure to risk, and this is gone. In addition, with the advent of the pandemic, women are being used more. Adolescent girls being used more in household tasks, in income generating activities for the families, which have been hit in this way. They have less time to study as against their male counterparts. They have less access to technology. This has increased the risk of child and early marriage and adolescent pregnancies. Boys' education has been prioritized, and we have also seen a class dimension, which has added to the multiple or intersectional discrimination against girls. Schools that can afford the technology and giving education through technological means are better situated. So first of all, girls are disadvantaged in technology. Girls who do not have access to resources, girls who are in rural areas have taken a greater hit from the closure of schools. Now, the other issue is that having experienced this freedom, having had the opportunity of earning income, there is always a difficulty of reintegrating into a more structured regime of school. And so when we engage post-COVID, we have to check that girls are back in school in the same area, in the same rate as they were before, and that they have not fallen out. Finally, my last comment is on daycare. With the closure of schools, daycares have also been closed. Now, it is almost impossible to give education to children at home at the daycare level. Technology will not work for most of them, again, with the intersecting discrimination. Then that care falls on the parents, and this is a proxy for saying mothers, who will now be constrained to leave their employment and come and take care of their children, because there's also a risk in asking caregivers to come in. In any case, resources to pay them will be difficult. So in the 4 minutes, I have endeavored to show that the fault lines have been increased, the spaces have been shrunk. In the area of education and violence, in spite of our robust jurisprudence, in the convention and in our general recommendations, the fault lines have not closed. I've given specific examples as relating to violence against women, where there's the intersectional issue. I've given specific examples, some specific examples in education. And this is the way that, from our perspective in the committee, we have seen the COVID disadvantage women. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hilary, for starting us off. I would like to turn the same question to Meskerem Gesette Chana now. Should I repeat the question or?
That's okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sebnem. I'd like to thank the Raoul Wallenberg Institute for this opportunity. It's a great pleasure to join my colleagues, the distinguished panelists, and also colleagues from all over the world who are with us today for this important conversation. It was interesting listening to Hilary, because most of the issues that I also wanted to speak about are more or less related, but I will try to keep my focus on those that are not very much overlapping, and also to build on some of the points that she already made. So the Working Group on Discrimination Against Women and Girls, it's part of the UN Special Procedures Mandate. Like the CEDAW, of course, we focus on discrimination against women and girls. I mean, on the elimination of discrimination against women and girls. Only that we are not a treaty body as part of the UN Human Rights.
Meskerem, are you here? Do you hear me? I think she lost the connection. Just a moment. she's here, but Ms. Karam, could you please turn off your video? Okay, then I will propose to give the floor to E-Point. And then when Ms. Karam is back, we will, after your response, we will turn back to Ms. Karam if she is back.
Sure.
Thank you.
Hi, good morning, afternoon, and evening. All the colleagues and friends, it's my great honor to speak in this panel. Thank you very much. The previous speakers has already drawn a big picture and the very important elements of how the COVID affect the gender equality. I will respond in my 4 minutes based on my own experience and the research with focus on the rights to health, especially the sexual and reproductive rights and health. The rights to health, in the full name, is the rights to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. It's pretty long. It was first articulated in the Constitution of the World Health Organization in 1946, whose preamble defined health as a state of completed physical, mental, and social well-being, and not a merely absence of disease or infirmity. This also state in the same documents that enjoy this rights to health without any discrimination, without distinction of race, religion, political belief, economic or social condition. So non-discrimination is also very, very crucial. And again, in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, also mentioned health as part of a rights to adequate standard of living in Article 25. So the rights to health is again recognized as a human rights in 1966 International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. So I don't want to give a long list of, I just want to emphasize the rights to health has been already recognized for quite a long time, and re-emphasized and recommitted by the member states by promoting, protecting these rights through the international declarations, domestic legislations, policies, at international conferences, etc., etc. Here, especially in ICPD Program of Action adopted in 1994 in Cairo at International Conference on Population and Development, and the Beijing Declaration of Platform for Action, both documents recognize sexual and reproductive health and rights. If we can, this year is the Beijing 25 years of Beijing. If you look at the Beijing documents, the section C on health, women and health, has a very profound, comprehensive agenda to promote women's health. It's recognized that the women's health in the four critical areas, like the working health and the professional, the conventional health, psychological health, reproductive and sexual health, as well as the environmental health. So the rights to health, if we look at the current challenge that posed by the COVID-19 on women's health, we'll have to reaffirm that the health is so fundamental. And the key aspect of rights to health that's based on the fact sheets on the rights to health published by Office of the UN High Commissioner for the Human Rights and World Health Organization outline some key aspects of rights to health. Of course, it's not only, the rights to health not only means that you get treatment when you're ill, it also include the rights to safe drinking water, adequate sanitation, because under the COVID-19, actually lacking of the safe, clean drinking water or the water for washing hands can, pose the great risk. It's another, the important factors: safe food, adequate nutritious and housing, Many tenants faced a forced eviction during the COVID because they cannot afford to pay the rent. The healthy working and environmental conditions, the workers working in the food processing industry, the gig workers for delivery expose a high risk of infection. And it's also, the main factors also include health-related education and information, including the comprehensive sexuality education that can prevent women and girls and everyone, and young people and adolescents from the violence, gender-based violence and sexual harassment, etc., and gender equality. That's all defined as the underlying determinants of health by the Committee of the on economic, social, and cultural rights. The rights to health also contains freedoms, contains entitlements, and health services, good facilities must be provided to all without discrimination. That's reinforced, this message, during the COVID-19, because the virus would have no discriminative feet, they will affect it. Everyone is, subjective to the, is exposed to the risk of infection. And all services, goods, and facilities must be available, accessible, acceptable, and of good quality. That's ensured it's become like human rights standards of the health provision that can be summarized as a, AAAQ, or the quality, equality, and accountability in health services. So this shouldn't be compromised, during the COVID response, because, there's a tendency that people see that, maybe there's more important and give the priority to provide the treatment and, services to the COVID-related, health problem, but has a less, emergency or urgency to provide the service. Other important services is equally important, like sexual and, reproductive health services, abortion services, other services, and, the medication for the, people with HIV/AIDS. So yeah, if we look at the, how the COVID has affected the women in all these, all these different areas of the health, and how this COVID has deepened, their, and exacerbated their risk, and also exacerbate the inequality and discrimination that they already, suffering. For example, the exclusion of the, the elderly people being excluded because there's all this digitalized, or, the devices, apps that based on the, the smartphone. If you don't have smartphone, you cannot go even on the public transport or board on the bus, because, you cannot show your healthy code, in my country. So that's become, the very disturbing fact that, the people, under this measures that enforces to contain the pandemic, actually those people are excluded. And also for the people with different, sexual orientation and gender identities, the contact tracking devices also expose their, their social, their sexual identity and gender identity and sexual orientation, which they don't want to expose because of the, the discrimination and, the discrimination and exclusion that exists in their society. So this also become a problematic, unless we can, reduce this, eliminate this kind of discrimination and exclusion. To contain the virus is becoming impossible. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Many thanks, Ipong. Ms. Karam is back, and I would like to give the floor to her again to continue responding. Ms. Karam, are you here?
Yeah, sure. I'm here. I
Perfect.
just put the video if just
Good
in
idea.
case. I don't
Floor
know.
is yours.
I don't know. It was sudden. Thank you. I will just quickly go through some of the observations, building on Hillary's and Yoon's. From our side, I mean, the exacerbation of pre-existing and deeply entrenched inequalities, already a point that's made clearly. We see that in four areas. One is the particular risk and exposure of women and girls to the infection itself, because of it could be because of age, disability condition, health condition, also the nature of the work they do. The other is the disproportionate burden in the family, economic burden, also social burden that significantly increased in the context of the COVID crisis. Of course, we have been saying that again, violence, gender-based violence has increased a lot, and also the diminishing space for women's participation, for amplifying women's voice and the recognition of their leadership. So in these four main areas, we see a lot of regression and again, exacerbation of pre-existing inequalities. I must qualify what I'm saying. We know that the extent of the COVID crisis itself is different from country to country. So we bear that in mind. It's a general statement, but we have, of course, particular country examples or situations. So women in all the countries are not facing the problem the same, but we know that everywhere inequality has increased. And the other is also women are not the same. They are in different situations. They have different experience. So we recognize that. So women and girls, when we say women and girls, in general terms, we bear in mind that they have different experiences and they are in different situations based on their age, their physical condition, their ethnic origin, their residence, and all. So having said that, I mean, a few areas that I can maybe illuminate would be, one is the disproportionate burden of unpaid care and domestic work for women and girls. I mean, even before the crisis, we know that globally women and girls undertake most of the unpaid care and domestic work. Actually, data shows that women and girls undertake more than 3/4 of unpaid care. And this is even worse in rural areas and low-income countries where women spend, for example, more than 14 hours a day in care work and in domestic work. So this figure has doubled or tripled in different parts of the world because of shutdown of schools, because of shutdown of care facilities. Then women are left to cover all this unpaid care and domestic work. So this has really significantly increased for women and girls. And earlier, Hillary mentioned that even school shutdown for girls does not only mean interruption of their schooling or education. It has a long-term effect in terms of how and what they do at home. And for girls, actually, COVID has increased a lot of domestic work, unpaid care work in different countries, and in particular in low-income or developing countries. This has, of course, greater, I mean, a long-term effect on the physical and mental health of women, the disproportionate burden of care and domestic work. And the other is also it has created a greater exposure for their infection to the pandemic itself, because they are even at home, they are frontline care workers. The other scenario is generally the economic burden. We notice that we know that women are already overrepresented in informal, poorly paid type of work in many parts of the world with lack of adequate social protection. And lockdown measures left them jobless with no alternative income or livelihood. We have seen this in many parts of the world, where women are already represented in different informal work sectors. We can see, for example, the situation of domestic workers, agricultural workers, sex workers, informal traders like street vendors and all. So in many countries, the lockdown has greatly affected them. We have seen interruption of work for domestic workers, for example. Not only interruption of work, but sometimes they are even forced into a situation of forced labor without their salaries being paid and dismissed from work. Some employers are, in order to mitigate the risk of the pandemic, they dismiss their domestic workers. Agricultural workers also have been greatly affected in countries where women do majority of agricultural work because of the lockdown, because they have to stay at home. Well, we know what it means, what the shutdown means for sex workers, where many their workplace being shut down. The other, in relation to this, is also the issue of labor exploitation. Not only loss of job, but there is also a situation of labor exploitation, and also regression in terms of labor standards, even in the formal sector, where women have paid work. We already know that they are concentrated in low skill, low wage type of jobs, and when there are staff layovers, they were the first to be affected, or in some companies that we see where there are leave without, where employees are forced to take leaves without pay. Women were the first to be affected. I mean, we see a lot of dismantling of previously established labor rights. So even both in the formal and informal sector, in terms of employment, women are disproportionately affected because of the pandemic. The other issue in relation to work is also workplace safety. In many places where women are expected or forced to work, workplace safety has not been also observed, and this has increased their exposure to the pandemic. And due to the nature of the work, the low skill, low wage, and also least secure type of job they undertake, they are forced to choose between their exposure to work under those hazardous contexts. I will leave the education part, which was already covered by Hilary, but before I conclude, I want to bring into perspective also women in different temporary homes or temporary shelters, like women in IDP and migration camps, women in prison, also women in different care facilities, like elderly women, women and girls with disability. These all also the confinement situation that they live with lockdown measures and social distancing measures means that they may not be visited by family. Also their care and support needs are not met. And even in this context, health system is weak or overwhelmed, so they are left even to greater exposure of the risk to infection and also the risk of violation of a range of rights. I don't want to go to the violence aspect, but generally in terms of gender-based violence and in all this gender injustice that we see, one important point to highlight is the lack of access to justice, courts being shut down, the lack of access to justice for women who already have disadvantaged in terms of effective access to justice. That has been also exacerbated. I would like to stop here, and maybe later I will come back when we have a chance to talk about recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Karam. Thank you very much. I'd like to move on to the next question now. So the question is, how might the world have looked different if CEDAW and other human rights protections had been implemented before the pandemic? How can CEDAW and other human rights protections guide the states in their COVID-19 response and recovery efforts? I would like to ask the speakers to limit their responses to maximum 2 minutes, because we are a little bit behind the schedule, and we really want to have enough time for the Q&A part. So I'd like to invite Ms. Karam to speak first. Ms. Karam, would you try turning up your video on, and we can see how it works?
Okay, thank you. It's a very interesting question. I mean, we would imagine a world where and all international instruments have been implemented, which means a world equal. Before the pandemic, all this, for example, the part that I spoke about, the disproportionate burden of care work, if care and domestic work has been distributed fairly between men and women, boys and girls, we would not have seen this significant burden being shared by women to the extent of increasing their risk to the pandemic and also risking their physical and mental health. Maybe also in terms of the part that I didn't touch, for example, we see housing issues. For example, if women had equal access to housing, land, or other economic resources, when they are faced with the pandemic and when they had to make a choice between a precarious job or staying at home, they would be in a position to afford houses, and then their risk of being evicted from their houses, or their risk of living in unsafe and poor housing condition where they have greater risk to the pandemic would have been less of a problem. So most of this, if we had social security or comprehensive protection from gender-based violence for women, I mean, all these issues or the gaps that we have seen going bigger would not have been, I mean, a bigger problem as they are already. I mean, so I think I would just stop here, because the next would be, so what do we do in terms of
yes,
addressing these gaps? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Hilary, would you like to continue?
Please, thank you very much. And I thank Ms. Karam for setting the tone for the response to this question, endorsing everything she has said. Now, from CEDAW's point of view, we have looked at, your question is twofold: how would the world have been, and what recommendations? How can we guide states? The world would have looked much different. We would have understood substantive equality, and therefore would have looked at equality from the perspective of equality of outcomes. And many of the things we are seeing now would not have come in. We'd have understood temporary special measures. So where there is no equality, would have seen it as part of a state obligation to put in measures, attain that equality, even if it means disproportionately or slanting these measures in respect of the disadvantaged population. And this time we're talking about women. Now, what we have done in the committee is that we have issued guidance notes on CEDAW and COVID-19 to states. Now, this addresses all the aspects, the 16 thematic articles of the convention. We have asked states in the face of the pandemic to do some of the following. to look at the disproportionate impact of health, the pandemic on health. Now, particularly we've looked at mental health because this is a part that is ignored in respect of women. The mental health of women, on which we have issued several concluding observations, is one area that is much overlooked. Then the protection of women and girls from gender-based violence and the provision of sexual and reproductive health as essential service. It's in the guidelines. We have also talked about the equal participation of women in decision-making. This is a very important aspect we have to look at because now, with the advent of with the onset of the pandemic, women coming into public office is even more difficult. How are women going to run their campaigns, their political campaigns for public office in the light of social distancing? This is a big issue. Then the socio-economic support, the stimulus packages that's moving forward, ensuring that women are active beneficiaries. If women were in decision-making positions, a lot of what we are advocating would be a matter of course because the women would be there with a critical mass to do this advocacy. Now we have seen the exclusion and greater exclusion of women from participation, from voice, because again, when women want to go on demonstrations or public expression of voice, COVID-19 regulations, laws, and rules can be used to clamp down and even close the voice aspect. It is here, because we have 2 minutes, let me just wind up. It is here that we have listed the disadvantaged groups of women and asked that states take a close look at them and the impact. Migrant women, older women, women with disability, women in poverty, refugees, internally displaced, indigenous, women in detention, LGBTI, and then women in humanitarian settings, so that in line with the SDGs, we leave no one behind. We've also asked for the strengthening of institutional response. That is the women's machineries, the National Human Rights institutions must also be given more clout going forward. I thank you.
Many thanks, Hilary. Ipyon, would you like to respond to the same question quickly?
Yes, I think I will follow the same line of my previous theme, which is on the right to health. So, if we already fulfill the right to health, the pandemic shouldn't have happened. But how, if we have missed that chance, and what we should do, what we can learn from this? One, I think, first of all, is to make the health services universal. That's already committed in the last year, the special conference held in UN on the states has committed to achieve the universal health coverage. The second, I think the state, to fulfill their obligation to respect, protect, and fulfill the right to health, do not harm is far not enough to achieve this goal. It requires progressive realization. What that means, one is to keep the essential public health service public, and it's also extremely important to reduce for reducing the inequality rather than exacerbate the inequality. So make the public service public, and also put the adequate financial resources on it. So from this pandemic, we can see that the country who have the robust and strong the public health services has a better performance in control the pandemic. And lastly, the role of the private sector. They should also be held accountable, because if we look at of course, the main obligation is the member state, the government, but it's the private sector role of the business sector cannot be overlooked, because the companies marketing their pharmaceutical products or the medical equipment, and also their activities also will have an impact on the environment that has polluted water, air, and soil, that has a consequence on people's health. So there's also, we should give attention to the role of the private sector. And lastly, I think the rights to health cannot be achieved without international cooperation and solidarity, which also has outlined in the Article 2 in the Convention on the Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So our speakers has already started talking about the recommendations and further actions needed. And our last question is actually focusing on exactly this. So what role duty bearers and private actors can play in ensuring human rights of women and LGBTIs are protected in the COVID-19 response and recovery efforts? What should be done looking forward? Could you share with us good practice examples addressing different aspects of gender inequalities and gender-based violence, gender-based discrimination in the context of COVID-19? Ms. Kerem, would you like to continue where you last stopped in your previous response? Would you like to share your recommendations and maybe some good practices?
Thank you. I'll just build on Hillary's earlier intervention. I mean, generally, of course, we would recommend for pushing for substantive equality. I mean, if we have substantive equality reflected in all policies, laws, and practices, I mean, this would have been different, even if we are in a context of crisis. So generally, not generally, I mean, specific to the pandemic or to the recovery efforts, one important recommendation is the recognition of the fact that the crisis affects women and men differently, boys and girls differently. As it should start from the recognition of this fact, so that law enforcement officials or duty bearers would start developing gender responsive, gender transformative policies and laws and practices, which would be human rights based or human rights compliant. And the other is to engage women or to promote and ensure the participation of women at all levels of decision making. This is one important aspect that we have seen, and we have, of course, good practices where, in as much as we saw the marginalization of women from decision making, we also see in some parts of the world where women have been included in leadership and resulted in very positive outcomes. So women recognizing women's leadership, amplifying women's voices, engaging with women and engaging with community is very important in designing the recovery response. The other is also to ensure service continuity. For example, health. Most health services have been suspended as non-essential that are very important for women, including sexual and reproductive health services. So duty bearers have to ensure the continuity of these services, essential services for women and girls during the pandemic. Not only health, schooling, access to justice, courts have to function. This is a time where we need a functioning judiciary or justice sector. It doesn't mean that everywhere it has to open, courts have to open face-to-face service, but we need some innovative intervention in this area to ensure continuity of access to justice for women and girls. And also efforts in terms of closing the gender digital divide would be important, because we see a lack of information for women from rural areas, from indigenous and minorities, and also women with disability in terms of accessing life-saving information and also rehabilitation and all that. So closing the gender digital divide in terms of availing most of the online information in this time is very important. I would end by also a recommendation on economic alternatives, ensuring and promoting economic alternatives for women who are really facing this economic burden due to lockdown measures. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Hilary, would you like to share your recommendations regarding the role of maybe governance, multilateral organizations? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. From the perspective of the CEDAW committee, we will have to construct our dialogues in a very targeted way this time. We would have an obligation, as I see, to look at each individual country and see the ways in which the pandemic has affected the particular country. And therefore, our recommendations would be more specific, more COVID-based, and more transformative. I think this is the first obligation that we would have as a committee. And I can already see the beginning of it from the guidelines that we have issued. One very important aspect in moving forward this way is data collection. We will have an obligation to ask for very specific data on the aspects affected. We've discussed most of them today, but it will be in the areas of health, looking at the under discussed areas, mental health, adolescent health, and have statistics. Would have to also look at the economy. And I thank Ms. Karim for hitting on a point that is very dear to my heart. That is what I call the COVID economy. The COVID itself has generated an economy. And we have to ensure that women participate in this economy, in the production of personal protective equipment, sanitizers, face masks, the low-hanging fruit. That will not be a problem at all for women anyway. We have to use special temporary measures to make sure that they engage in this aspect. This is not to say the other hand, the high end is close to them. This is also a part that I already talked about, the stimulus packages. Access to health, access to justice, very important. Ms. Karim mentioned it, but I will do so again, because it is a bridge between the rights and the responsibilities. We also have to look at the role of informal justice systems. This is what I'd like to add to what has been said. I already touched on the strengthening institutions. This is an area that the committee will have to look closely at, because unfortunately, some of the institutions have had their roles downgraded in the COVID. Others have had their roles strengthened. We have to see this opportunity as a strengthening, especially of the national women's machinery. Then, two groups that we have not mentioned and we have to look at as a committee very carefully is the engagement of the youth and the engagement of the media, so that no one is left behind. Because of the 2 minutes, please let me wrap up here. If there's another opportunity, there are other points I have, and I will go on to them. But I think on the scale, these are the salient areas I think that we should look at, in addition to many of the things that Ms. Karim has said, especially technology. I would have gone into that in detail, but that is cut out for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hilary. Ipyon, would you like to also share your last words about recommendations and maybe some good practices? Thank you.
Yes, as the member of the civil society, I think the civil society has played a very critical role in this to fight this pandemic. One is, of course, they faced, the numerous challenges, especially they're, not able to access to their community and constituency because of the lockdown and social distancing. On the other hand, is the cutting funding has, affect their operation. However, I think they have tried their best to maintain their services to the most needed population, as well as provide, the policy recommendations and, the new normative thinking on how to recover from the COVID. Just some, maybe the measures to be taken. Many governments have struggled to balance the dilemma between saving lives or saving jobs, but actually these two go hand in hand. So the government should pay, I think, first, they have to put the saving lives at the first and priority. to recognize these lives are equally entitled to rights, dignity, and prosperity without any discrimination and on any ground. There has been many encouraging signs just coming from, my country experience. Like China has learned from this crisis and transforming towards a more sustainable development model. There's no target GDP growth for this year in government development plan. And there's a new amendment, wildlife protection law that's enacted in February, right after the outbreak of this pandemic. But until the migrant and gig workers and women, many that's showed by women, have a decent job, until the house workers, many are women, are supplied with necessary protection equipment, until the elderly people no longer refused or denied access to the public services because they don't have, because of digital divide or what other, the disadvantage, the position they have, until the poor children have, access to the online courses, until the AI, the new technologies, and using to, to track the contact, this technology and devices are regulated properly for the privacy and the human rights concerns, the recovery from the COVID-19 remains a distant dream. That's even now we don't have a new cases emerge. So that's my last words. Thank you.
Thank you all for your responses to that. Your responses have highlighted some of the key themes that we hope to touch upon. I think it is now time to turn to the Q&A and address some of the questions raised by our participants today. First question is, COVID-19 protective measures have been used to justify rights violations. How can CEDAW and other human rights instruments be deployed to respect, fulfill, and protect without increasing vulnerability to abuse? Anybody would be welcome to. Who would like to respond to this question? Hilary, would you like to respond to this?
I'm muted. Yes, thank you. I think that I may have already begun to respond to this in the last intervention I made. But I think our response will be threefold. One, to ensure the adherence and the implementation to the normative framework that has been ratified, the convention, the general recommendations, the soft law as well. Secondly, engagement with actors. The CSOs have been mentioned. Oh, I'm sorry. The CSOs have been mentioned. The other entities that provide information. And then we must ensure that the information fits the parameters that I've alluded to. And this is information that can enable us interrogate the actual situation on the ground. Thirdly, we would ask more now than before that CSOs and other submitters of information do so database with accuracy, pointing out the more now than ever. So these are the three ways in which I think that the committee can engage moving forward and ensuring that there is no gap, protection gap. Also, the concluding observations must be those that must be actionable, must fit the situation. And then in our follow-up procedure, we must probably look at better compliance, because this is what is going to tell us what the country has done within 2 years or less. And this is going to be a very important indicator of how the committee, the international arena, is responding to the COVID. One area I did not mention, and I think let me just throw it in now, we must also look very closely at stereotyping, because there is a lot of stereotyping of women, of disadvantaged groups of women within the context of the COVID. And this is another area that we must place, give close attention, pay close attention to in as a committee. Thank you.
Thank you so much. One question from Christian Pena says that Ms. Tai Yiping mentioned that universal health services, as well as keeping the public services public in a country, would be needed to tackle the inequality in health. Keeping the health services public is necessary. More and more countries are going on the opposite direction. How can CEDAW convince countries that these are basic requirements in order to obtain equality in health? Who would you like to speak to this question?
Can you repeat it? Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Sure. Tai Yiping mentioned that universal health services, as well as universal health services, should be kept public to tackle the inequality in health. More and more countries are going on the opposite direction. How can CEDAW convince countries that these are basic requirements in order to obtain equality in health? Publicizing the health services.
To respond to this, because we are doing something, but maybe we are not doing enough. So she probably will be better situated to tell us how we can up our game and make it more responsive. I thank you very much, and sorry for putting you on the spot, but I think the answer will be better coming from you.
Hello?
Yes, we hear you. You can go ahead.
Yeah, I think there's if how to use CEDAW, that's maybe should be answered by the chair of CEDAW committee. But I just want to re-emphasize why it's important, and this is based on the evidence coming from the combating the COVID-19 pandemic. There's a counter evidence that is the failure of the privatization or the marketization of the basic public health services, because there's a lot of this initiative that trying to privatize the basic public health services based on the misperception that that must be more efficient, the quality is better, but many research has shown the opposite, give the evidence that actually they have increased the spending, the out-of-pocket spending of the client, and then they didn't improve the services. And actually many of those, this privatization or through the program of public-private partnership, actually it end up like the public money have to finance the private health services. So this is actually give us a lesson. This is a very pitiful, the painful lesson that learned that how these, the failure of the public health would lead to the, the devastating the pandemic like COVID-19. So I think that is why we should, but how? I think one is that we should identify what is the basic health services. That's also very important. It's not only economic, important, because it depends on how much money that actually the government, the public sectors should invest. But it's also political, importance, because what is included in this so-called basic package, whether the women's the sexual and reproductive health services are part of this, like modern contraceptives and abortion services, etc., are included. So I think we still need to do more research and and also trying to find out the best way to convince the policymaker to address this issue. I thank you.
Thank you so much for your response. One more question. What special considerations shall be in place to deal with the specific situation of women employed in the informal sector in this COVID-19 times? Ms. Kerem, would you like to respond to this? Specific situation of women employed in the informal sector.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, maybe following from earlier point Hillary made on temporary measures, I would like to begin from there. We understand lockdown measures maybe the only options in some countries, but in some countries they may not be. So we have the spectrum from partial to full lockdown. But in all this, for women working in the informal sector, one important policy response would be particular attention to special measures for this group of women. Actually, Hillary mentioned earlier a very important point about COVID economy. So to help women engage more in a type of work or productivity that would be relevant to the context, and for that they might need special economic support from government. For example, in many low-income and developing countries, we know small-scale women's entrepreneurs are supported by different micro finances, and maybe it's time to also increase those type of special measures or support package for women in the informal sector, so that they have the means to engage in so-called COVID economy, to produce and engage in a more in COVID context. The other is in some places, maybe it's also important to balance the measures that are applied on street workers, for example, and from the special procedures, from the larger body of the special procedures. For example, a guidance note was issued on the implementation of state of emergency measures, which calls for a balancing exercise, because in some, I think I saw also a question in relation to that. In some places, some states are taking the measures too far, while they don't provide alternatives for women's and the poor and the vulnerable livelihood. So so in that case, balancing would be a very important measure, while of course people on the street respect social distancing and other COVID complaint measures that are called upon by the state. The other is okay, I think I'll stop here, sorry. Because the question was about informal workers.
Thank you so much. Since we have received so many questions, I would like to keep the discussion going, but unfortunately time is over and we are already some minutes behind the schedule. We have been able to discuss the COVID-19's gendered human rights implications. We have touched upon how the world might have looked different if CEDAW and other human rights protections had been implemented before the pandemic. Our speakers have presented some specific recommendations and mentioned some good practices that could be inspiring for the COVID response. And on behalf of the Raoul Wallenberg Institute, I would like to thank each of our panelists for being here today to share their important insights into the conversation. As the Institute, we firmly believe that putting human rights and gender equality principles at the center of design and implementation of the COVID-19 response and recovery can create a huge difference. Governments, public institutions, cities, national human rights institutions, courts, law enforcement, corporations, these all can play significant roles in ensuring human rights of women are protected in the COVID response. And we are committed to play our role as the Institute. We are committed to produce evidence-based, policy-oriented knowledge and support our partner institutions around the world in promoting and protecting human rights and gender equality while dealing with the COVID-related challenges. We will be announcing another webinar in October, and the publication of our multi-country research initiative will be finalized before the end of the year. As I mentioned earlier, 15 research projects have been currently implemented. The findings of these ongoing research projects will hopefully shared with you before the end of the year. So please continue following us. Thank you very much to all our panelists. Thank you, our impressive audience, for joining us and for your amazing questions. And also special thanks to Maya Milik-Bekova, our Senior Program Associate, Christina Geyer, our Head of Communications, Stefan Lindström and Lotta Objörsson, our technical team, who are the behind-the-scene heroes who have made this event possible. I see Morten there. Morten, would you like to say a few words before we close the session?
Yeah, no, I just want to basically echo you and say thank you very much for a fantastic conversation exchange. It's been extremely enriching. I have a very long list of issues to bring forward in different ways with the Institute. And as Shebnem said, we are totally committed to continue the work on the COVID follow-up, gender, human rights, and all the many aspects of this. So thanks for contributing, and of course a big warm thanks to you, Shebnem, for having pulled all this together and being our driver in this very important work. So thanks to all, and have a nice evening, and have a nice weekend.
Many thanks, everybody. Hope to see you in our next webinar in October. Thank you again. Thank you, our panelists. You're amazing.
Fantastic.
Take care and keep safe. Bye.